Okay, welcome everyone. How's everybody doing this evening? Good, I hope. Okay, tonight Dr. Lisle is going to do Science Confirms Biblical Creation. So with that, it is all yours.
All right, so we're going to see how science does confirm what the Bible teaches about creation. And then after this, we will have a Q&A session after this as well, and those are always fun. So I think it's important for Christians to know some of the basics of science, because the narrative in our culture is that science and the Bible don't mix, right? That's the narrative that we've heard, especially when it comes to origins. Because science teaches millions of years of evolution. That's what science has discovered. And of course, the Bible teaches God created in 6 days, as we talked about this morning. But what I want to show you is that narrative is false. The narrative that science is against biblical creation is false. The evidence is consistent with creation. And you might wonder, why are there two different views? Because there are a lot of scientists that believe in evolution. And some of them are very brilliant people. And I don't want to disparage them. I've worked with some brilliant people at the University of Colorado, right over in Boulder. I had the pleasure of knowing them. They disagreed with me on origins. But I know my stuff too. I was able to get a PhD at that university. So why is it that creationists and evolutionists both can be very educated, can look at the same evidence and come away with different conclusions about how it got there, what it means, different ideas about origins? Because if you think about it, we have the same planet. When we look at the Earth, when I look at fossils and things like that, I'm looking at the same stuff that my secular colleagues are, but I'm looking at it through a different lens. That's the difference. It's the mindset. We all have a mental lens through which we examine the evidence, and that lens helps us form our conclusions about what the evidence means. Creationists and evolutionists have different lenses through which we interpret the data. And I have to tell you, we've been trained, all of us, to think about things from a secular perspective. You'd be surprised how much you've picked up from your culture. It's inevitable. The Israelites, they picked up bad habits from the nations surrounding them. Well, the United States, our public education system, it is secular. And don't get me wrong, I know there's some good Christian teachers in that system. Praise God for them. I think they can reduce the damage, really, I do. But nonetheless, the curriculum is secular. It absolutely is, because the people that control that, the majority of them, are secularists, and so they teach a view of origins, and our children are inculcated with that. We've been inculcated with that. We've been trained to think about things from a secular perspective, and this absolutely true for me. Absolutely true for me. And I've spent the last 20 years trying to unlearn that. And I haven't arrived yet. I'm getting there, but I haven't arrived. And the secular view is that millions of years of natural processes produced Earth features, mountains, valleys, canyons, life on Earth. Millions of years of evolution is responsible for that. And so when evolutionists look at the data, they already have that view in their mind. They absolutely do. They're thinking in terms of secular processes. Even before Darwinian evolution, they were already thinking in terms of natural processes leading to the life that we see on Earth. That's not the true history of the universe, though. We need to retrain our minds to think in terms of biblical history, biblical thinking, which we summarize with the 7 C's. It's kind of a neat way of remembering biblical history, 7 words that start with the letter C. Pretty neat. So we begin with creation, where God created a perfect world that he himself called very good. No death, no suffering, created in 6 days a few thousand years ago. And it doesn't take God long to do stuff. Some people say, but wouldn't it take millions of years to make an earth? Not for God. He can do what he wants. Christ can turn water into wine immediately. It doesn't take long periods. But the earth didn't stay perfect for very long. There was corruption. God gave Adam dominion over that world. And when Adam rebelled against God, his treason affected everything under his authority. God cursed the earth when Adam sinned. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, he said. And so thorns and thistles are recent. They're a result of sin. They're not millions of years old. We find them in rock layers that secularists believe are millions of years old, but we know as Christians that they came into the world after Adam sinned and as a result of his sin. Catastrophe, the flood. God is righteous and he will judge sin. Only a corrupt judge would let sin go unpunished. And so God, being righteous, he sees the wickedness of mankind as becoming great, to where every thought of man's heart is only evil continually. And so he wiped out humanity except for Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Grace, forgiveness. And Noah and his family were saved on board the ark, along with 2 of every breathing land animal. And then confusion. Again, mankind rebels against God. And God, this time, having promised never to send another worldwide flood, splits up the peoples according to languages. He scrambled their languages. We think that's responsible for the couple dozen base language groups, and languages have diversified since then, of course. And also responsible for the different ethnicities as people brought different traits with them and so on. It makes perfect sense. And then Christ, God himself, steps into history, something he promised to do back when Adam and Eve fell into sin. God promised that one of Eve's descendants would take care of the problem of sin, crush the serpent's head. And throughout the Old Testament, God gave more information about this Savior. And it seems like the Jews were never able to put it all quite together. But it's all there. It's all there, that the Savior would be Yahweh himself. Because the Bible says in the Old Testament, there's no Savior except Yahweh, who is God, right? And yet it would be a descendant of Eve. How could that be? How could it be a human and also God? Christ is human and God. Christ steps into history, pays for our sins on the cross. He lived to die. He came so that he would, and he willingly laid down his life so that he would take on our sins, be our representative on the cross, so that by trusting in him we can be saved. And then the 7th C, which has yet to happen, in its fullness anyway, the consummation, where paradise lost will be paradise restored. And we can only enter into that new paradise if our sins have been paid and our nature's been changed. And that's something only Christ can do. So that's a brief summary of biblical history, and one that has yet to happen in its fullness. Although it starts when we're saved, right? Because we're a new creation. That's the view of history that we should have when we look at the evidence. We've been trained not to think that way, but that's the way we should think. And what I want to do, creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, and consummation. Okay? Now, what we're going to do this evening is take a look at a few different branches of science, briefly, because we don't want to be here for millions of years. We're going to start with genetics. I'm going to spend the most time on that one because it's very, very relevant to origins. It's the study of how traits are passed on from one generation to the next in humans, in animals, in plants, genetics. Then we'll briefly talk about information theory, which you may not have heard of before, but that's okay. We'll come back and talk about that. And then finally, geology, the study of rocks. And that you're going to find that ties in very strongly with the worldwide flood. A lot of the rocks that we have today are from that worldwide flood. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And we'll see, my goal here is just to show you, to train you to think biblically about all those issues. Believe it or not, I'm not going to prove creation this evening. I do believe it's possible to prove biblical creation. I have a book on that called The Ultimate Proof of Creation, which shows that only this lens would make science possible. And so secularists are stealing from our worldview when they try to do science. I'm not saying secularists can't do science. Some of them do very good science, but they're stealing from the Christian worldview when they do so. But what I want to show you this evening is simply that when you use this lens, the evidence makes sense. And this will give you some starting points in conversations with unbelievers. Okay, so let's jump in and start with genetics, the study of heredity, the study of how animals change from one generation to the next. Do animals change from one generation to the next? How about dogs? Do dogs change from one generation to the next? Do they? They do. What do they change into? Dogs. Yeah, there you go. Dogs change into, but you can get different breeds, and we'll see how this works. But God created dogs, and they've reproduced, and he built into them the ability to diversify into dogs. Now, that's not evolution, that's just dogs. But it is variation within a kind, and that's something we creationists believe in. The Bible makes it very clear that God made organisms after their kinds, or after its kind, or after their kind. That's a phrase that's used 10 times in Genesis 1. We better take it seriously. And apparently the kind is the reproductive limit of an organism because God brought 2 of each kind on board Noah's Ark to preserve life. If the kind was not the limit, God could have just brought 2 animals on board Noah's Ark and then they could diversify into everything. But he brought 2 of each kind. That tells me the kind is kind of the limit of reproduction. How many kinds are there? Well, there's There's debate about that. But for example, cats are all the same kind. Did you know that? And I mean all cats. Like that big lion that you see at the zoo and the little pathetic thing you come home and pet. Yeah? They're the same kind. They're descended from two cats that were on Noah's Ark. Isn't that interesting? All dogs are one kind. So yes, all those different breeds of dog, they're all the same kind. You see, kind is not the same as species. And that's something that we need to understand. Species is a rather modern word. I know some Bibles, interestingly, use that, but really they shouldn't because it's a modern word. The Bible talks about kinds, and apparently animals reproduce the same kind, but you can get different species from the same kind. A group of mosquitoes is separated from a parent population, and 100 years later, their descendants are not able to interbreed anymore. So they're classified as a new species, but they're still mosquitoes. Always have been mosquitoes, and unfortunately, they always will be mosquitoes. That's the only thing they can give rise to. But you can get change. See, I have to mention this because sometimes evolutionists misrepresent what it is that creationists teach. And they'll say, oh, creationists believe that God created all the species as we see them today. No, not true. I don't believe that God created poodles in the Garden of Eden. Because it was a paradise, right? So, yeah. Okay. Animals have changed a bit since creation. Dogs, yes. Dogs were in the Garden of Eden, just not poodles, okay? Animals change with time. And so what we actually believe is something like this, variation within a kind. Dogs always have been dogs and always will be, but you can get different breeds. And so the original dogs might have looked a bit different than dogs today. They're still dogs, but the modern breeds, those are modern. Things have changed since creation. And poodles are just one of these branches that prove that something has gone horribly wrong. Okay? But they remain the same kinds. They remain the same kinds. Very important. And some kinds have gone extinct. We don't have dinosaurs anymore. There are some kinds where one variety has gone extinct and other varieties remain. Elephants, for example. Mammoths used to live on this earth. Mammoths, we think, are part of the elephant kind. We think they're the same kind. But the mammoth variety has gone extinct, but we still have African elephants and Indian elephants. So some varieties remain while other varieties have gone extinct, and some kinds have gone extinct. And some kinds have given rise to many different varieties, especially with dogs. Dogs, there's lots of different breeds of dogs you can get. But all those dogs were descended from two dogs that were on Noah's Ark. And we'll see how that works. We'll see how that works. It's pretty impressive. But evolutionists teach that the kind of change is unlimited in an upward kind of change, because in the evolutionary view, the first organisms were single-celled organisms, kind of like bacteria. And as they reproduced, they became multicellular, and they diversified into all these other organisms that we see today. And so in the evolutionary view, the kind of changes that organisms experience are unlimited. Bacteria can eventually become people. Now, I reject that. I believe people have always been people. I believe dogs have always been dogs. But you see the difference between the two. So to see which of these aligns best with science, we need to know about DNA. This is a long molecule that occurs in the cells of your body. It's actually, you have different sections of DNA called chromosomes. But the DNA looks like a twisted ladder. And on the rungs of this ladder are what are called nucleotide base pairs. There's 4 different varieties, and they're abbreviated by the 4 letters that you see there, C, G, A, and T, because the names of the chemicals start with those letters. And it turns out that if a C is on one strand, a G will be on the other. C's and G's always line up. And if an A is on one strand, a T will be on the other. A's and T's always line up. Okay, chemically, they're attracted that way. But on a given strand, you don't know which letter is going to come next. C, C, T, A, C, T. You don't know which letter is going to come next, right? And based on which letter comes next, it spells out the proteins that make up you, which is amazing. In your DNA are the instructions to make you. You have 3 billion of them, times 2, because you have 2 sets of DNA. You get 1 set from dad, 1 set from mom. So you have 6 billion instructions in you that make up your body, your physical traits, perhaps your personality to some extent. Amazing. Amazing. I mean, we think, oh man, we can get all this information on a Blu-ray. That's impressive. God put the information to make you on molecules. Wow. And the reason that you were a person and not a cabbage is you have instructions to make a person. Cabbage has instructions to make cabbage. And you got the long end of the stick on that one, okay? So it's the same way you could spell help with Morse code with beads on a rope. You could write a book in DNA. It's a 4-letter alphabet, so the language is different. But the instructions to make the proteins that make up you are encoded in your DNA. And I'm tempted to go into more detail because it is amazing. It is amazing. There's instructions to start the new protein. There's instructions to stop. It's amazing. But we'll save that for another time. I do want to point out you have 2 sets of DNA, and it's the combination of your 2 DNA strands that determines your traits. So it's not just one strand, it's the 2. And you can have dominant and recessive. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is why you look a little bit like your dad and a little bit like your mom. You look a little bit like your siblings, but you have some differences too. It's because you have a unique combination of DNA, unless you have an identical twin. You have a unique combination because when mom and dad, when they have children, each child gets one of the 2 genes from each parent. A gene is a section of DNA that controls a trait. So you have a gene for eye color, gene for blood type, and so on. So and you don't know which one you're going to get in advance. Only God knows. But 50%. So maybe these genes, the first child gets, the next child gets those ones, the next child gets those ones, the next child gets those ones. Each child has a unique combination of DNA and therefore unique traits. That's a pretty brilliant way of programming in variety in just 2 people. Think about that. It means when God made Adam and Eve, he had you in mind too. All the instructions, all the information to make up you and me, every human on the planet, were in Adam and Eve. But you see, because the number of variations, the number of possible combinations is enormous. Between a married couple, you take a typical married couple, the number of unique combinations of DNA for their children is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. It's incredible. And so, what a brilliant way of building in variety. Here it is with blood type. Blood type, I think, is pretty easy to understand because there are only 3 possible genes there. You have A, B, and O. Those are the 3 possible genes that determine blood type. If you get A from mom and you get A from dad, your blood type's A. If you get A from dad and O from mom, your blood type is still A because A is dominant, O is recessive. A dominant gene will take over a recessive one. And likewise, if you get O from dad and A from mom, your blood type's A. So those are the 3 ways you can have blood type A. If you get B from dad and B from mom, your blood type's B. Or if you get a B from one parent and an O from the other, your blood type's still B. Okay? If you have an A from one parent and a B from the other, your blood type is AB. Those are codominant. And the only way you can have blood type O is to get O from mom and O from dad. Then your blood type's O, which is actually a fairly common blood type because the O allele is common. Here's what I find interesting. If mom has blood type A, and let's say it's what we call the heterozygous A, where you have A and O, and dad has blood type B, and let's say it's the heterozygous B, where you have B and O, then the children could have any possible blood type. In one generation, the first child could get the A from mom, the O from dad, have blood type A. The next child could get the B from dad, the O from mom, and have blood type B. The next child could get the A from mom, the B from dad, and have blood type AB. And the 4th child could get the O from mom, the O from dad, and have blood type O. Interesting. Because the first child says, hey, I got mom's blood type. Next one says, I got dad's blood type. Next one says, I got AB. Where's that? The next one says, I got type O. Am I adopted? No. But see, you can have traits different from your parents because you have a unique combination. And that's why you might say, I've got my dad's eyes and my mom's hair, but where did this come from? Well, it's because you have a unique combination. You still got the information from your parents, but it wasn't expressed because you have a unique combination. Amazing. Brilliant. Here it is with skin shade. People talk about skin color. We all basically have the same skin color, brown. It's just a question of how much. There's a pigment called melanin. There's a couple forms of it. There's a yellow form and a gray form. This is the gray form here. And if you have a lot of melanin and it's widely distributed in your skin, you're very dark-skinned, like in the upper left corner. If you have very little melanin, like in the lower right corner, so you have very light skin, you're light brown. And if in the middle, of course, there's possibilities there as well. Now, if you're in, say, the bottom right corner, and you get married to somebody in the bottom right corner, your kids are going to be in the bottom right corner, aren't they? Because that's the only combination possible is lowercase letters. That's it. And likewise, if you're anywhere along that diagonal. But if you go off axis, let's say you go to the upper right box where you have big A, big B, you would have medium brown skin. If you got married to somebody that's in that same box, your kids could have any skin shade from very dark to very light. So we think Adam and Eve probably, by the way, were in that upper right box. There's other ways God could have done it, but that would make sense. They weren't Caucasian. They were probably kind of a medium brown, and their kids could have been very dark to very light. They would have had a tremendous variety. And there's still places in the world where that happens, certain places in India where at the same dinner table, one's very dark, one's very light. They're siblings. Pretty neat. But we're going to talk about dogs and variation within dogs because dogs have a lot of heterozygosity. Big A, big B. Lots of potential variety, and that's expressed in the dog varieties that we see, the different breeds. And dogs reproduce a lot more quickly than we do, so we can see over time how their generations change. But here's the point I want to make. Bacteria, they have some instructions too. All life on Earth is based on DNA. All life on Earth. That's the molecule of life that God used to encode the instructions that make us and everything else. And evolutionists say, well, see, that's because we're all related. We're descended from bacteria. No, it means we have the same creator. But in any case, bacteria have some instructions, and they have the instructions to make bacteria, which is what they are. A horse has a lot more instructions because it's a more complicated critter. It's not just that it has more DNA, which it does, but it has more instructions. It has instructions bacteria lack. A horse has information in its DNA to make eyeballs. Bacteria don't have those instructions, and they can't make eyeballs, right? A horse has information to make bones. The DNA of bacteria does not have that information, and bacteria can't make bones. You see what I'm saying? So if bacteria evolved into horses over millions of years, then at some point they had to gain brand new information in their DNA, right? That makes sense. Evolution can't happen unless somehow new information gets into the DNA, information to make the structures that the horse has that the bacteria lack. And that's very important. I want you to remember that. Evolution requires an increase in genetic information. And you can see why that would have to be the case, because horses have a lot more information in their DNA than bacteria. And that's very important because the processes that we see in nature, even the ones that evolutionists parade as examples of evolution, do not increase the information in your DNA and are therefore irrelevant to evolution. I want to give you an example of this. One example would be natural selection. A lot of people have the misimpression that natural selection is the same as evolution. It's actually the opposite. Natural selection is true. And it was invented by God, but it was discovered by a creationist before Darwin had anything to do with it. Darwin may have coined the name, but he didn't come up with the idea. Natural selection involves differential reproduction, basically. Organisms reproducing different traits by different amounts based on their environment. So here's how it works. Suppose you have two dogs, and suppose each of these dogs has one gene for short fur and one gene for long fur, and suppose those genes have a combined effect, they're codominant, and so each dog has medium length fur. And this is simplified, but the basic genetic principles here are true. Now, if those dogs have pups, some of the pups will get the short gene from mom, the short gene from dad, and they will have short fur. Some of the dogs will get the short gene from one parent, the long gene from other, and have medium length fur just like their parents. In fact, statistically, 50% of the population would have that combination, wouldn't it? And then some dogs will get the long gene from mom, the long gene from dad, and they'll have very long fur. Now, this is a great example of variation within a kind, because we started out with dogs that had information for short, medium, or long fur, but only the medium fur was expressed. And then in one generation, you have lots of variety. Short-haired dogs, long-haired dogs, medium-haired dogs. Pretty neat. But they're still dogs. And they always will be. But suppose the environment gets very cold. What's going to happen? The dogs that have the short and medium-length fur, they don't do so well in a cold climate, do they? And in the worst-case scenario, they die. Very sad, right? But the dogs that have the longer fur, they thrive in a cold environment because they're well insulated against the cold. And so they meet other dogs that have also survived because they also have long fur. And when they reproduce, what kind of dogs are they going to reproduce? Dogs with long fur. Yeah. And that's the only possibility, isn't it? Could they ever go back to short or medium length fur? No. Not if those have gone extinct. Not if those kinds have been lost. Because that information has been lost. Oh, wait a minute. Evolution is about increasing information. Natural selection reduces it. We started with information for short, long, and by combination medium. We ended up with just information for long. The dogs that had the information for short and medium fur, they're gone. Natural selection is the opposite of evolution because it reduces genetic information. Now, if we started the experiment over and you got all three varieties, and this time, what happens if the environment gets very hot? What happens? Well, this time, the dogs that have the longer fur, they don't do so well in that environment. So sadly, they die from heat stroke, right? The dogs that are best able to survive and reproduce are the ones that have the shorter fur. They meet other dogs that have survived because they have short fur, and when they reproduce dogs with short fur. Okay? Again, we haven't gained new information. We've lost information. Natural selection is the opposite of evolution. But it does explain why we find dogs in parts of the world that we find them in. Sure enough, dogs that end up in the colder climates, they do have long fur. If they didn't, they would have died. Dogs that end up in the hotter environments, they do tend to have thinner, shorter fur. If they didn't, they would die, and so on and so forth. That's why you don't need two of each breed of dog on Noah's Ark. You just need two dogs. And they have in their genetics, they have the information for lots of different traits. And as they get off the ark and reproduce and spread away from the mountains of Ararat, they carry certain traits with them. And if those traits are conducive to survival in that part of the world, then they thrive. And if those traits are not conducive, they have a tendency to die off. Now, it's not always that extreme. You can have traits that are just a little bit inconvenient, and the dog has a chance of survival. It's not always extinction or survival, but it could be in between as well. But nonetheless, dogs that end up in cold climates do have thicker fur. And we'd expect that. It's not because they said, oh, I'm in a cold climate now. I better evolve fur. They already had the long fur. It was part of their genetics. And it worked out well for them in that environment, and likewise for the dogs with the thin fur. This is a great example of natural selection, but it's not evolution, because we haven't gained any new information. The genetic information for short fur and long fur was already in the dog kind. It just wasn't necessarily expressed, you see, until the environment changes or they go to a different environment. So this is how we account for the different wild dogs in the world. It's the different combinations of genes that are available, okay? And that's how you get the different wild dogs that we find in the world. Natural selection. Great example of natural selection, but no new information has been added. It's just big A, little a, big B. We think the original dogs, we think the dogs that were on Noah's Ark were a lot like the wolf variety, where they had, because wolves have heterozygosity. They got big A, little B, big C, little c. And then they can give rise to dogs that have just the big B's, just the little A's, and so on. But what about mutations? Because evolutionists say, but Dr. Lisle, it's not just natural selection, it's natural selection acting on mutations. What's a mutation? Typo in your DNA. It's a mistake in your DNA. So dogs should have normal, healthy legs because they've got instructions for normal, healthy legs. But sometimes in the process of, well, there's different ways mutations can happen, but sometimes in the process of copying the DNA, a mistake is made. And so that poor little guy is missing some instructions, and so his legs don't form properly. That's kind of a shame. And by the way, I do have to point out that most mistakes, most mutations, your body can immediately correct. It's amazing. You have a built-in spell checker. I'm not kidding you. You have a built-in spell checker that will correct 999 out of 1,000 mutations. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. But because we live in a fallen world, it's not perfect anymore. 1 in 1,000 gets through. And he's missing some instructions. Now, some mutations are devastating. Some mutations are immediately lethal. There's a mutation that will cause your heart not to form properly. You're not going to pass that on to the next generation, are you? Because you're going to die. And then there's some mutations that are just really inconvenient, like having short legs if you happen to be a dog. But this is not evolution because we haven't gained any new information. We've actually lost some information. Mutations just lose it faster. They don't gain brand new instructions. They've scrambled instructions, and so you end up with a dog with short, stubby little legs. Now, if you think about it, in nature, a dog like that one on the right, he's not going to do so well in the wild, is he? He can't catch anything on those short, stubby little legs, he can't run very fast. He can't catch anything. He's more likely to be caught by something else. Okay, so he's on the wrong end of the food chain at this point. So that's a very inconvenient. And so nature tends to weed out mutations. because animals that have them have a tendency to die, right? And again, some are immediately fatal. Those are not passed on. Some like this are just really inconvenient, but a dog like that probably could not survive in the wild. But some people like dogs that have short, stubby little legs because they can't jump up on you as much. And so people will take these little dogs into their households and care for them. And that little dog doesn't have to survive in the wild. He has a human slave caretaker to take care of all of his needs, right? To feed him and give him water and spend millions of dollars trying to keep him alive, right? Because he's missing some instructions. Therefore, domestic breeds of dogs tend to be full of mutations. Some of you maybe have a dog that could not hack it in the wild, right? And there's some wonderful breeds of dogs. I love golden retrievers. They're so beautiful and wonderful. Could they hack it in the wild? Probably not. Probably not. A dog like that definitely couldn't. There's a mutation that causes a dog's snout not to form properly. Dogs are supposed to have a long snout. There's a mutation that causes the snout to be short, but the jaw was designed to fit the longer snout, so it has a horrible underbite. The skin was designed to fit the longer snout, so the skin hangs off the side. If you don't clean it, you get infected. And some people think that's cute, but you think the dog says, gee, I love having my nose stuffed into my face. That's great. This is what mutations do. They don't give you superpowers. They give you that. Okay? As another example, poodles. They do have some problems. By the way, I'm not anti-poodle, but they're cute, but they have some problems because they have mutations. This is just a list of either direct mutations, diseases that are directly the result of a mutation, or as a secondary effect. For example, we talked about the regulation of fur length, right? Poodles actually have hair rather than fur, but the gene that regulates their hair length is damaged, and they can't regulate it. Their hair grows forever, which means if you have a poodle, you have to give it a haircut every now and then, right? That's why you will never see a poodle in the wild. You'll never see that because they would keep growing their fur until you end up with a big poof ball and then they can't get anywhere, right? You will never see a National Geographic special, out in the Australian outback, the mighty poodle stalks his prey. You're not going to see that. You're not going to see that. If you see a poodle, it's in a human household. Yeah. They could not survive out from it. And even there, humans have to take care of it, give it a haircut. If it doesn't, you can get in their eyes can get infected, they can go blind. A lot of poodles suffer from that. Again, their ears can get infected, it can kill them under certain circumstances. So this is not evolution, folks. We've lost information. We haven't gained any. Mutations are in the wrong direction to make evolution work. So is natural selection. They both remove information from the genome at best. And so this is how we account for the different domestic breeds of dog. It's the different combinations of information that God put into the dog kind, along with mutations, mistakes that have crept in, that cause some problems in some of these breeds. But this is not evolution. It's in the opposite direction. So we think the dogs that were on Noah's Ark were more like the wolf variety because wolves have a lot of heterozygosity, a lot of information, big A, little a. And as you selectively inbreed them, and that's what you're doing, that's how you get a breed, you inbreed them. And that concentrates the mutations. It reduces the number of variation in the instructions. The nice thing about that is you know what kind of dog you're going to get. The bad thing about that is you know what kind of dog you're going to get. Okay? But this is not an increase in information, it's a decrease. Theoretically, you could take two wolves and by selectively breeding them and picking the traits that you like, you could theoretically get down to a poodle again. I don't know what you'd want to, but you could. Okay? But you could never take two poodles and breed them back to a wolf, because those instructions are gone. When I explain this to kids, I say the information in the dog's DNA is like jelly beans. And so the wild kinds of dogs, lots of jelly beans, lots of potential information. But then as you selectively breed them, you get down to the poodle, and then that's kind of it. That's kind of the bottom line of the dog world there. You can't really remove any more than that and still have it live. So there you go. But could you ever turn a dog into a cat by removing jelly beans? And the answer is no, because a cat has Jolly Ranchers, okay? It has different information. I do have to point out, because evolutionists will, some of the instructions in our DNA are the same. Did you know that? You have some of the instructions that are the same as in a banana. Is that because we evolved from a banana? No. It's because, what does the DNA do? It tells you what proteins you're made of. And when we eat bananas, it's got some of the same proteins we have, so we can gain nutrients from it. You see, if God made all the different organisms on earth with totally different DNA, they'd have totally different proteins, which means we could not consume them and gain nutrients. We'd have to eat each other, and that would be a problem, right? So God knows what he's doing. So this is how we account for the different varieties of dogs, and it makes sense in light of what creation teaches, but it's good observational science. We can watch how dogs reproduce, and we find they reproduce dogs. You can get lots of different varieties. That's what we'd expect based on the information dog planted, or that God planted in the dog kind, and the two dogs that were on Noah's Ark. God would have picked dogs that have maximum heterozygosity. This is good observational science, and it's consistent with creation, with God having created the original information in the dog kind, and we've lost some sense. And we've lost more than we would have because of the curse, because our mutation correction system is no longer perfect. Now, I do have to point out that mutations can be beneficial. They can help you survive under certain circumstances, but it's by losing information. I'll just give you one example of this. Bacterial resistance. There's a bacterium called H. pylori that causes stomach ulcers. You don't like that. So you go to your doctor, he gives you an antibiotic. The antibiotic, your cells cannot process. It just passes through your cells. But the H. pylori has an enzyme in him that's part of his system that when it reacts with the antibiotic, it converts it into a poison, and the poison kills the bacterium. And you feel better, okay? There's a mutated form of H. pylori that lacks that enzyme. At least he doesn't have very much of it because he's missing some instructions. And so you take the antibiotic and it just sits there. He lacks the ability to convert it into a poison, and so he survives because he's lost some instructions. Okay, and so that's why you get these so-called superbugs that become resistant to antibiotics. That's how it happens. There's different ways that can happen, but all of them involve a loss of information, not new information. And they survive. They survive because they've lost information. It's the opposite of evolution, isn't it? Because remember, evolution, you have to increase information. That's a decrease in information. Every example evolutionists will give you when you go and examine it, it's a loss of information. It's in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. Dr. Lee Spetner, PhD, biophysics, Johns Hopkins University, says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. Really, everyone? He says not even one mutation has been observed that adds little information to the genome. I have to point out, there are different types of mutations. There's a mutation that can cause a section of your DNA to be duplicated. People say, there you go, more information. Really? If you're reading a newspaper article and a paragraph got duplicated, do you have any more information? Could you learn anything from this duplicated paragraph you couldn't learn from the original? No. It's longer, but there's no more information. You don't learn any additional details, right? It's the same with DNA. DNA you can have duplicated genes, but that doesn't add any new information. The information was already there. So when we take a look at DNA, applying good observational science, it's consistent with creation. God having created the initial information in the genome, and we've lost some sense. It's not consistent with evolution. We've been talking about information. There's a whole branch of science devoted to information, how it's transmitted and so on. Very important field in our computer age, because computers deal with information. What is information? We kind of have a feeling for it. You read a book, it's got information in it. Dr. Werner Gitt, one of the world's experts on information theory, and he's a Christian and a good guy. I've met him and chatted with him. He's pointed out, and I'm summarizing his results, that information always entails a symbolic code system, language, and meaning, an action and an expected purpose. So if you pick up a book, there's a symbolic code system there. If I pick up a book and I see the word horse, I don't see an actual horse. I see a word that represents the animal. That's a code system. This represents that. There's language. The books that I read, English primarily. I can read a little bit of Hebrew, but I'm not fluent in it. But in any case, there's a syntax, there's grammar, right? There's nouns, there's verbs, there's predicates and subjects and so on. So there's a language structure. And finally, there's meaning. There's an expected action on the part of the reader. When the reader reads this, it's expected that he'll do something. It doesn't matter whether he actually follows through or not. If you write a book, you intend for the person to do something. Maybe just learn information, but maybe take an action and go out and do something. And there's an intended purpose. There's a reason that the information was transmitted. A cookbook fulfills those three criteria, doesn't it? Because a cookbook will have a symbolic code system. It'll say 3 tablespoons of sugar. It'll say take that and mix it with this and so on. There's language. There's sentences, right? There's subjects and predicates telling you what to do. And there's meaning. There's an expected action on the part of the reader that the person will take the ingredients and mix them that way. And the purpose is so you won't go hungry. Cookbooks fulfill that. Could this be information? Well, does it fulfill the three criteria? Remember the three criteria? Symbolic code system, language, meaning. Is there a symbolic code system? Looks like it. It looks like those are symbols. Is there language? Well, they're not just spread apart. It looks like they're organized in the sentences. Is there meaning? That's the tricky one. Because in order to know if it has meaning, you have to know you have to be able to decode it. When scientists first discovered hieroglyphics, they suspected that they meant something, but it wasn't until the Rosetta Stone they were able to decode it and prove, yes, this is indeed a language. Well, I know the code system. This is Genesis 1 through 5 in the form of icons. You see the clipboard, that's in the beginning, like in the beginning of a movie, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and that it was good. Neat, huh? That's Genesis 1 in the form of icons. So yes, that's information. Pretty neat. Now, once you establish that something has information, there are certain laws of nature that apply. Just like when you have energy, there are laws of nature pertaining to energy, that it can't be created or destroyed, but it can only be transformed. Likewise, there are laws of information. And one of the laws of information is that information never spontaneously self-generates in matter. Dr. Werner Gitt puts it this way. He says, there's no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. And you know that. If you have a bowl of alphabet soup and you stir it up, you got all the symbols there to make any word you want to make. You stir it up and you say, okay, here we go. And it forms these wonderful sentences, doesn't it? Once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered week. No, it doesn't do that, does it? You might get a word. Hey, cat. But that's about it, right? You're not going to get information. So this is very intuitive. Information does not spontaneously generate in matter. Where then does it come from? Where does it come from? If you pick up a book, it's got information in it. Where did it come from? An author, a mind. And that, in fact, is a law of nature. It appears to be. Dr. Werner Gitt says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. Yes, indeed. It comes from a mind. Now, I have to point out, non-mental processes can copy information. A computer can copy information. A Xerox machine can copy information, but it can't produce it. It can't produce it. It takes a mind to produce brand new information. And I have to add a little caveat in our age of AI. Well, can't AI write new things? No, it's scouring the internet and taking information that humans have produced and assembling it in new ways using sophisticated mathematical algorithms. And it's amazing. I'm amazed at what AI can do, but it can't think. It can't think. There's nobody home. The lights are on, but nobody's home. Yeah. It's amazing what it can do. And it's only able to do that because of the laws of math that the Lord's given us access to. But no, every piece of information leads to the mind of the sender. And so if you pick up a book and it's got creative information in it, you can be assured somebody wrote that. Now, they maybe didn't write that copy. That was probably made by a machine that makes lots of copies simultaneously, and it got its information from a computer, which got its information from a computer, but ultimately somebody wrote it. Okay, now that makes sense, right? I mean, it wouldn't occur to you to think if you found a book, oh wow, and it's got good information in it, this probably came by an explosion in a typewriter factory, which they don't make anymore. But anyway, you get the idea. You know somebody wrote it. Maybe not that copy, but somebody wrote the original information. Because information always originates in a mind, right? What do you got in DNA? Information. Information always originates in a mind. Where did the information in your DNA come from? Ultimately, it came from God, the mind of God. Now, it didn't directly. I mean, you got your information from your parents, and they got it from their parents, all the way back to Adam and Eve, but they got it from the mind of God. So you see, information theory is consistent with biblical creation and genetics. Evolution isn't. Because according to evolution, all the information in your DNA did not come from a mind. It came about by mutations and natural selection, which are not mental processes. Evolution would have you disbelieve in science in order to believe their particular fairy tale. Isn't that interesting? And by the way, in their heart of hearts, even evolutionists know that information ultimately comes from a mind. They suppress that truth and unrighteousness, but they do know it. I know they know it because I did a social experiment years ago. I put this article up on my blog then, now on the Biblical Science Institute website, called On the Origin of Articles. And it's a satire. It's supposed to convince you that articles do not have authors, but that they are spontaneously generated when as a collection of typos, most of which make the article worse, but occasionally they'll make them better. They probably start out as a single letter, and then over millions of years, as the article's copied, more letters are added, and eventually it becomes sentences and paragraphs. Now, granted, most random mistakes make the article worse, but those ones are thrown out. And so articles become better and longer over millions of years, and they do not require an author. It's a stupid article, and it was fun to post it. The funny thing was not so much the article, it was the responses I got to it. I can't tell you how many evolutionists chimed in and said, "We know you wrote this, Dr. Lisle." And I'm like, "Really? How do you know that? Did you see me write it?" "Oh, you're taking it on faith." "Oh, that's interesting." "Well, we can track down the IP address and prove that you posted it." "Oh, I admit to posting it. When this thing evolved on my computer, it was too good not to share it," right? Yeah, it just showed up, exactly. And they kept going back and forth. By the way, you can read these conversations on our website. If you go to our website and do search for that article, and then underneath it, you can read the conversations I had with these people. It is really fun. It'll be a fun afternoon for you, trust me. But the fun thing was I was playing the part of an evolutionist. And I was using their arguments. I was saying, "Oh, you're one of those people who believes in authors. I mean, that's fine if you believe that, but keep it in church, man. I don't want to hear that," right? Will you teach this in schools? That, articles have. In fact, if this article has an author, let him show himself right now in the article, and then I'll believe. "Oh, no? Oh, see, no author." Which was funny because I'm the author. But anyway, it was really fun. It was really fun. They could easily have defeated me. All they'd had to have said was, "Well, we know you or somebody wrote this because it has information in it." But not one of them said that. You know why? Because then they'd have to admit evolution is false. They're not going to give up that. They would rather be reduced to foolishness than bow the knee to Christ. The Bible says something about that. Interesting. Let's talk about the geology now. These rocks that we find, and what a blessing to live in Colorado, where we have these amazing Rocky Mountains that I would argue are a result of the flood. But secularists would say, no, these rock layers are millions of years old, and that's the first thing I want to talk about here, is that we know the age of these rocks. And people have misconceptions about that. They say, well, radiometric dating, right? I mean, that just magically tells you the age. You pick up a rock, you scan it with your tricorder, and it measures the age of goals and tells you the age. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. There is a method called radiometric dating that allows you to make a guess about the age of a rock, and that's what it is, based on certain assumptions. So we're all made of these atoms, right? You got protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then electrons circling in a cloud around that, something like that. That's a sort of elementary picture of it. But some atoms are unstable, meaning they will spontaneously change into another atom. It's called radioactive decay. And most atoms don't do this, but a small fraction do. So, and you don't have to do anything to it. Uranium-238, for example, is radioactive. After a while, it just says, I really don't like being uranium-238, and it will spontaneously change into thorium-234. You don't have to touch it. It does it all by itself, atom by atom. And then thorium-234, so there's uranium-238. It will eject some energy. It'll eject an alpha particle and then change into thorium-234, which is also unstable. And so it will eject a beta particle and turn into protactinium-234, which is also unstable and will decay into uranium-234, all the way down to lead-206. Lead-206 is stable. So once you reach lead-206, it'll stay lead-206 forever. Now, most of the particles we're made of are stable like that, so you don't have to worry about changing into something else tomorrow. But a small fraction of them are unstable like that. Radioactive, we call that radioactivity. And we find rocks that have these elements in them. So the bottom line is, if you had a chunk of solid uranium, and we know the rate at which this happens because we can measure it. It happens atom by atom. You don't know which atom's going to change next, but you do know that after a certain period of time, a certain fraction of them have changed. It's kind of like popcorn. You don't know which kernel is going to pop next, but you do know that after about 2.5 minutes in the microwave, you're done, right? Same way with uranium-238. But it would take billions of years, theoretically, for it to change all the way into lead. And so the idea is, if you find a rock that's got some uranium and some lead in it, you find that rock somewhere on the Earth, you can work the clock backwards and figure out, you might say, when it was all uranium. You can do that, but how do you know it was all uranium to start with? How do you know I didn't make the rock yesterday half uranium, half lead? See? You don't know that, do you? So that's one of the assumptions that's made in radioactive dating, is that you know the initial ratio of parent to daughter element, uranium to lead. You can think about the uranium changing into lead like sand going from the top chamber to the bottom chamber in an hourglass. Uranium changes to lead. You can use an hourglass to tell time, can't you? Yeah, that's sure, if you make certain assumptions. If you came into this room this evening and I had an hourglass just like that sitting here on the table, and I asked you, how long ago did I turn that over? You said, what's an hourglass? Looks like it's about halfway done, half an hour. Say, I got you. I turned it over 1 minute ago, but already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. That's one of the assumptions. How do you know that the rock had no lead in it to begin with, or that it was all uranium? You don't know that. How do you know somebody didn't add sand when you weren't looking? Right? That can happen. In rocks, uranium is leachable, and salt water can move in and out of the rock. Oh, you got to be careful about that. How do you know the throat of the bottle has always been the same size? Well, for an hourglass, that's probably a pretty good assumption. But we don't know what causes the rate of uranium to decay into lead. We don't know what causes that. That's unsolved physics at this point. We have some ideas of it, but the point is, maybe it decayed faster in the past. If you don't compensate for that, you'll get an age estimate that's inflated. And by the way, there's good evidence that radioactive decay was much faster in the past. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But these are some of the assumptions of radiometric dating. That the initial conditions are known, that you know the initial ratio of uranium to lead, which you don't know, that the decay rate is constant, there's good evidence it isn't, and that the system is closed, that uranium hasn't moved in and out of the rock. But here's the point, folks. We know that at least one of these is wrong because we have tested radiometric dating on rocks whose age we already know. When Mount St. Helens erupted back in the 80s, it formed brand new rocks from the magma. We took some of those in, sent them to a secular lab, paid them to date them using radiometric dating methods. And we did it that way so we couldn't be accused of bias. We're using secular labs. And we didn't tell them they were brand new rocks. Normally you wouldn't do that because it's expensive to do the process of radiometric dating. But we wanted to test the method. And they came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that we know are brand new. That's the thing I want you to remember. If you don't remember all the details about the assumptions involved, just remember this. Radiometric dating has been shown to not work on rocks of known age. Secularists assume it works on rocks of unknown age. Is that logical? I don't think it is. If I gave you a calculator for Christmas, Merry Christmas, here's a calculator, and you put 2 plus 2 equals, it gives you 47,153.2. You're like, I don't think this works. I said, trust me, it works on big numbers. If you can't trust it on little numbers, how can you trust it on big numbers, right? Biblical principle there. What about carbon dating? Carbon dating is better. Now, it's not perfect either because it's also based on assumptions. But the assumptions here, when we test it on known things, it tends to get the right answer. So I have a little more confidence in carbon dating. Carbon dating, it involves the production of C14. C14 is produced in the upper atmosphere as cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, convert them into C14. Most carbon's C12. But there's a variety that's C14. C14 is unstable and will decay back into nitrogen. Got a half-life of 5,700 years. So when you're alive, you're breathing, you're eating. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. 1 atom in a trillion is C14 instead of C12. So plants get a little bit of C14 in them, and they use that carbon dioxide to make more plant. And then we eat the plants, or animals eat the plants, and we eat the animals, and we get that carbon in us. So a small fraction of you right now is C14. So you're all slightly unstable. How about that? But it's decaying back to nitrogen. On the other hand, when you're alive, you're replacing it because you're eating new food, you're taking in more C14 and you replace it. And so when you're alive, the C14 to C12 ratio in you is about the same as it is in the environment until you die. And then it just decays away because you're not replacing it anymore. Okay, so C14 to C12, C14 ratio, when you're alive, it's the same. And then when you die, the C14 decays away. But C12 doesn't because it's stable. And so by measuring the C14 to C12 ratio in something that has died, you can tell how long ago it lived. And it tends to give the right answer within the ballpark. It might be off by a factor of 10, but never by 100 or a million or anything. And it always gives ages that are friendly to biblical creation. How about that? Diamonds have C14 in them. They can't last millions of years. The C14 would be long gone. They can't even be 1 million years old. Oh, the C14 would be gone. Coal beds. We find C14 in every chunk of coal we've ever tested. They used to use coal to calibrate the machines under the assumption that coal would have 0 C14 because it's hundreds of millions of years old. They don't do that anymore because every chunk we've tested has C14 in it. There are lots of processes like that. The rate at which salt flows into the ocean. So oceans get a little bit saltier every year because even fresh water has a little bit of salt in it, which it picks up from the land and dumps it into the ocean, 450 million tons per year. The water evaporates, but that leaves the salt. You do the math, the maximum possible age of the oceans would be 62 million years, which sounds like a lot until you realize that secularists believe the oceans are 3 billion years old. And that's an upper limit, right? Because you can't have less salt than no salt. So that's the maximum possible age. It's perfectly consistent with 6,000 years. That's an upper limit. A lot of these age estimates are upper limits. The rate at which mud accumulates on the ocean floor takes less than 12 million years to accumulate the current amount. And that's assuming no worldwide flood, which would have deposited all that very quickly. So it's perfectly consistent with biblical creation. Human population, how long does it get Earth's current population of humans? Thousands of years, not millions. But the best evidence that the world's thousands of years old, we have the birth certificate of the universe in the Word of God. So the secularists like to say the Earth's billions of years old, take my word for it. And of course, they change their number every few years anyway. God says, I created in 6 days, take my word for it. I know where my faith is. And the evidence is consistent with that. It really is. The fossils that we find, the evidence is that they were buried rapidly. That's how you get a fossil, especially under flood conditions. That's probably the best way to do it. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's the best way to get a fossil. You got to bury it quickly. This is a fossil ichthyosaur, a marine reptile now thought to be extinct, buried in the process of giving birth. You see the baby ichthyosaur being born there? They're born tail first because they're air breathers. So as soon as he's born, he has to swim to the surface, get his first breath of air. There's a fish fossilized in the process of eating another fish. That didn't take millions of years. Most things don't fossilize at all. If you've seen a dead animal left by the side of the road, it doesn't fossilize. It doesn't turn into a statue. It decays, right? Until there's less and less of it. The fleshy parts decay away first, and then the bones are left, and then eventually things like acid rain will dissolve even the bones, and it's gone pretty much. To get a fossil, you need to bury something. But even then, I was given the wrong impression because I was told these rock layers, I went to public school, I was told these rock layers were formed over millions of years. But they got fish in them. If this layer here was deposited 1 million years after that layer, the fish would have decayed. I know from animals left by the side of the road, they don't last millions of years. Most fish float anyway. Why do we have millions of fossil fish on the world? How do you drown a fish? Think about that. If you want to form a fossil fish, here's how you do it. You go home to your aquarium. There's our little fish, oblivious to what's about to happen to him. And you pour some concrete on him. That's going to do it. That's going to bury him. It's going to kill him. Kind of sad, but there you go. And then usually there's enough microbes left that they can eat away at the soft parts of the fish, but then the bone mineralizes. The minerals from the concrete go into the pores of the bone and fill it up. You end up with a stone in the shape of a bone. That's what a fossil is. Bones are very light and porous. Fossils are heavy because the minerals have filled in all the holes in the bones. That's how you do it. Flood conditions. Great way to form fossils, and that's what we'd expect. There was a worldwide flood. That's how we get most of the fossils that we have on Earth were from that flood. Maybe a few afterwards, but we think most of the fossils on the Earth are from the global flood associated with Noah in Genesis, described in Genesis 6 through 8. What about the kind of fossils we find? I was told they support evolution. And I was shown this. I remember this in one of my textbooks in the public school system. There you go. See, there's the evolution of the horse. Well, with the exception of the first guy, which is actually a rock badger. Wait a minute, it looks like a horse. That's because the artist was told, draw what you think this early horse looked like. But the actual bones are a rock badger. The rest of those are horses. But they're different sizes. Yeah, horses come in different sizes. But their feet are a little bit, yeah, there are small differences in the feet. Some of the ancient horses were three-toed, whereas the modern horse has one toe. That is a really small difference. Their number of ribs is a little different. Yeah, but it goes in a different order. Oh, if you put them in order of ribs, did you know the order's different? They leave out that little detail, don't they? But they're different sizes. These horses are different. These are both adult horses. They're different breeds. We have horses of different sizes today. What's your point? What we find in the fossil record is variation within a kind, which is what we have today. You don't find any evidence of a non-horse becoming a horse. See, all the examples they give you in the textbooks are examples we're comfortable with in terms of actual fossils. Things, variation within a kind, different varieties of dog, different varieties of cat, some now extinct. Saber-toothed tiger's not around anymore. Okay, they're cats. We don't find a non-cat evolving into a cat. We certainly don't find reptiles evolving into birds or anything like that. What they will show you, if it's an actual example of something, is something we'd agree with. It's variation within a kind. Now, if they show you an in-between form, I guarantee you they don't have a fossil for it. It was an artist that drew that. What about the rocks in which these fossils are found? Don't rocks take millions of years to form? Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. Here's a man-made mechanical clock found inside a solid rock. How about that? That's the one rock we know right when it happened, because it's got a built-in clock. I mean, that's kind of neat. That's the one exception. What about these rock layers? There's a person down there for scale. Those didn't exist before 1980. Those were formed in the Mount St. Helens eruption. And not all of them are consolidated into rock, but some are. The top layer, that's rock. And it doesn't take millions of years to deposit layers like that and to harden to rock. Concrete is artificial sedimentary rock. It doesn't take millions of years to form. Mount St. Helens demonstrated that. This canyon didn't exist before 1980. Canyons don't take millions of years to form. They take catastrophic conditions. That was one volcano, and it cut out a canyon 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours. Catastrophe is what generates these things, not millions of years. The fine layers that you find in these rocks, they used to say, oh, those are annual layers. 1 year, next year, you add them up, millions of years. Except that's not from the Grand Canyon, that's from Mount St. Helens. Yeah, those didn't exist before 1980. They're not annual. It had to do with the way the mud flows. And that's the same kind of laminations that you find in the Tapete sandstone. That formation covers much of the United States and Canada, which means whatever did that covered the continent. We don't have those kind of catastrophes today. Why? Because God promised never to send another global flood. I'm not going to go through all these or we'd be here for millions of years. But I do want to point out that geology strongly confirms biblical creation. The evidence we see in geology is evidence of catastrophe. This world was once flooded with water. The rock layers that were laid down, sedimentary rock layers, the way the Rocky Mountains were pushed up under the tectonics of the global flood, and the fact that they have very little erosion. They'd be highly eroded if they were millions of years old. They're not. The real message of the rocks, repent. Because it reminds us that God judges sin. He's done it before with water. He's going to do it again by fire. Are you ready? That's what it comes down to. And the only way you can escape the coming judgment is by placing your faith in Christ, who can save us from our sins. And he's the only one who can. And he did that on the cross for all those who trust in him. Just as Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and Noah was a preacher of righteousness, the Bible says. I'm sure he was out there preaching, come on board the ark and be saved. And only his own family responded. We don't know how many people were on the planet at that time, but good estimates could be billions. 8 people were saved. Isn't that interesting? And God was the one that closed the door on the ark. That's not an accident. God is the one that determines time of mercy is over, time of judgment begins. That's why today is the day of salvation. Well, again, we have some books on these resources, some DVDs as well. The Ultimate Proof of Creation. What I did tonight was kind of whet your appetite, hopefully, and show you that the science confirms what the Bible teaches. But if you want a proof of creation, that's the book. And that really is training you to think and debate the way that Jesus did in his earthly ministry. Clear thinking is the key. Biblical thinking is the key. You don't have to know a lot of details about science. I like science. I like studying the details. But you don't have to know a lot about that to defend the faith well. And we do have that on DVD as well. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, How to Better Enjoy the Night Sky from a Christian Perspective. That's a fun resource. It's got a planisphere in the back, which is a wheel that you match the date and the time. It'll show you what the stars look like that night. It's kind of neat. And mine's the only one, as far as I know, that compensates for daylight saving time, which may go away if is it the House that needs to pass it or the Senate? I forget. Senate? Okay. Anyway, I don't know if that'll happen or not. If it does, I'll have to make a new star wheel. Anyway, lots of DVDs out there. Worlds of Creation, like I did this morning, and then Astronomy Reveals Creation, which is a good follow-up for that. Created Cosmos takes you on a tour of the universe. It's really a short movie, very visual, very moving. It's not a lecture or anything like that. His star, the star that guided the Magi to Christ, really interesting subject. Physics of Einstein, Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason, answers over 400 alleged Bible contradictions. Great book to have on your shelf as a reference for when the critics ask, because they will. And then God's Law, applying God's commandments today, and which ones apply, and how does the government, is the government supposed to get involved in certain things? Really helpful resource, I think. Introduction to Logic, how to use your mind rightly and to the glory of God, and that's a lost skill in our society. So learn how to think properly so you won't be fooled when people use fallacies, mistakes in reasoning. And we have a teacher guide for that too, if you want to use it with your students. Secret Code of Creation. This is my personal favorite. It shows how God has built incredible beauty into an aspect of creation most people have never even thought about. It's really neat. And we have that on Blu-ray as well because it's quite beautiful. And the book that goes along with that, Fractals, The Secret Code of Creation. You might leaf through that book. Every picture in that was not drawn by human hands. Artwork of God, including the cover. Pretty neat. And there's no secular explanation for what you're going to see there. Keep in mind, you can get the best of our books, not all of them, but in our book pack, we have a few of those left. Take advantage of it. That's only for tonight. And likewise, our video pack, our DVD pack, the best of our DVDs, or the library pack, the best of both, books and DVDs for a 30% discount. Great way to have an immediate creation library at your disposal. Tonight only, we don't do these packs on the website. Again, our latest book, Alien Life, for students, elementary to junior high, I think. And really well done, masterfully done by Dan Lisle. And you read it first, and then you give it to your kids, because you'll learn stuff in there too. I guarantee you, it's pretty neat. We have a lot of children's resources. These are done by our sister ministry, Answers in Genesis. Answers for teens, answering the hard questions that teenagers ask. Answers for kids, likewise. What about continental drift? Does that happen? And was there an ice age? And what about the dinosaurs? Where did they go? And where did the water for the flood come from? And where did it go? And how did Noah get two of every kind on the ark anyway? All answered in those books. And by the way, a lot of adults don't know the answers to those questions. So again, you read it first and then you read it with your kids. It's really a book for adults disguised as a kid's book. One Blood for Kids, answering racism, because that's becoming an issue again. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be. It's going to show you that there's really only one race, the human race, and it'll show you how genetics works and things like that. Some of the stuff we talked about this evening. So great resources for children. Check those out. And don't forget to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Just make sure you put your email address or you'll get nothing, because it is an electronic newsletter. Comes out around the 15th of the month. So there you go. Check us on the web as well, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. We're going to take a 10-minute book buying break, and then you can go out and check those out. And this will be your last opportunity to buy books. And then in 10 minutes, if you want to come back, we can do a Q&A session. Those are a lot of fun. But my assistant's going to be packing up the books during the Q&A, so you won't have an opportunity after the Q&A to buy books. Get them now. Okay? Thank you very much. We'll see you in a few minutes.